started in Yellowstone Park in 1979 as a bus driver tour guide. So I started learning about the history of the park. And hopefully I can talk up louder before I lose my voice.
Where were you from?
Sparks, Nevada is where I grew up. And I thought I was going to come up for one summer and play around and go back, and here I am 37 years later. So I've been studying the Yellowstone Park history ever since. So, and it's, you know, you could write volumes and volumes and volumes on individually. We'll see, he was my instructor when I came to 1979. He was my tour guide instructor when I first got started. As he says, the well of Yellowstone history is so deep, you know, everybody can pull from it and pull up a bucket full with no problem whatsoever. There's all kinds of things we can talk about. And so this afternoon I was trying to put some notes together, and I came across some stuff I just wanted to show you guys, because we're into research. We do a lot of research at the museum these days. We have a really good research center going on, and it's getting bigger all the time. We're getting new archives. But this is just these are two little books. I think one of them, I still have one for sale. This was done by Bob Goss, Making Concessions in Yellowstone. So here's a whole book by alphabetical order on all the concessions that he could identify in the park. And let me tell you, there's a huge amount of them in there. And then this one is a book that researchers on Yellowstone, we live by the chronology of Wonderland. And Bob did this, and it's he breaks it down into administration, hotels, transportation, post offices, bathing pools, a little bit of everything. And then you go to these different sections. I was going to find it here. I should mark that.
Does he have military in there also?
Oh yeah, the military's in here. Discovery, Indian affairs, military activities, building and construction, wildlife management, interpretation, tourism, museums, railroads, roads and bridge development, transportation, mail stations, hotels, canyon, all the different areas, on and on and on, gateway communities. And this is just, and then what he does is he's got a date, and then there's just like one or two sentences. But then there's a reference to the books where all that information comes from. So you're talking libraries about Yellowstone Park. So when you get to where does my information come from, I couldn't even begin to tell you. I have about 125 volumes of Yellowstone stuff that I collected over the years that I use. And then I was going through my stuff and I found this, and this is I'm going to read all of this tonight.
I'm glad I brought my sleeping bag.
Yeah.
The library made for you all.
Yeah, exactly. This is my notes for an 8-hour class that I used to do called Humans Amongst the Geysers. So this is basically my kind of look at what I pulled out of the cultural history of Yellowstone Park. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes out of these, and I've got to take these home because I haven't looked at them in a while. I did this when I was in West Yellowstone.
Humans what?
Humans Amongst the Geysers. And I used to teach it as an adult education class.
Paul, was it about people that were always spouting off?
Huh?
Was it about people that were always spouting off?
Yeah. Yeah. Hot under the collar and all that.
Yeah.
So anyway, you got to start thinking, the cultural history, that's huge, And I'm going to start where I started with my earlier group, and that's 12,500 years ago at Anzac site up here in Wilsow. We know that people were here that long and they were using this area. Now, of the 110 Clovis artifacts that were found in the Anzac site, there's no obsidian, which at first they found kind of interesting because usually you find obsidian in all those types of collections. But there's no obsidian in the Anzac collection. But the Anzac collection comes within, they feel about a 50-mile radius of the area up there where they gathered all that material. There's a question about maybe some of it came out of Wyoming, which meant that somebody was crossing the Yellowstone River, which was huge. As Larry Laren pointed out to me, 12,500 years ago, the Shields River was as big as the Yellowstone is today, and the Yellowstone would have been as big as the Missouri is today. So to cross those rivers would have been a major undertaking. But no obsidian. And of course around here, the obsidian cliff is the major source of obsidian. Chemically, they can trace back obsidian back to its source. Over the years, they got enough geological background chemistry Obsidian from Obsidian Cliff in Yellowstone National Park is found all over the western United States, and 600 and some pounds of it were found in the Ohio Mounds at Mountville, Ohio. Made it all the way back there. So it was prized. It's a really good, what they call high quality source of lithic material for making arrowheads and spear points. And so you think, why didn't Anzac, why didn't they have any? Up till 8,000 years ago, these mountains were still covered with glaciers. So 12,600 years ago, you probably couldn't get into the park. You might have been closed off. The Obsidian Cliff may have been under ice still at that point, or it would have been very, very hard to have gotten into there. Somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago, they were at Gardner when they did the original, well, not the original, but what is today the old post office at Gardner, which I think is a laundromat today across from the old K-bar down there. They found a Folsom Point, which dates back about 10 to 11,000 years ago. So we know they were there. Osprey Beach, which is in the southwest section of the West Thumb, the west thumb of the lake, the big West Thumb area. They have a site there, an archaeological site there that shows continuous occupation for about the last 8,000 to 9,000 years, which is the same amount of dating that the Myers-Hinman site over here has. So they were going in there in the summertime. Now 8,000 years ago, the top of the mountain still had glaciers who were still glaciated out, but they were going in there in the summertime. There's a debate whether they went in there in the winter or not, but we know they were there in the summertime. They were there for the last 8,000 to 9,000 years. So people have continuously been using this area for that long. So the cultural history goes way back. By 6,000 years ago, they find evidence at the Shoshone Basin, and we could go on and on. There's a really good book. 2 years ago, they published 2 books. In fact, we had guys come down and do the archaeology of Yellowstone. That was the one that got snowed out, and we had to redo it. I don't know if you guys made it to that one. 110 people. There was people out here. It was incredible. They talked about that. Anyway, the Yellowstone Park, I'm going to kind of jump back and forth here because I'm not quite lined out here, but 1872 when the park was created, that's 4 years before Custer. So the Custer battlefield was 1876. The Nez Perce, the flight of the Nez Perce was 1877, and they came through Yellowstone Park. They took the Cowan Party, captured the Cowan Party, took them hostage along what's now called Nez Perce Creek. And so there was a lot of feelings about the Native Americans up here. So Nathaniel Langford and he was the first park superintendent, some of the early administrators, they needed people to come to the park. They've always needed people to come to the park. We don't need so many anymore. But back in those days, they needed people to come to the park because they needed to get money from the government. And the only way they were going to get money from the government is if people were interested to come to the park. So they felt the people aren't going to come to the park if they're afraid of the Indians. So Nathaniel Langford is probably one of the big ones. He started the story that the Indians were afraid of the Yellowstone region. They were afraid of the hot springs and geysers, so they didn't go up there. And he starts this whole story, and there's all these tales come out about the Indians talking about being afraid. Oh, we don't go up there because of, the sounds and the noise and the hot water. Well, archaeologically, we know. From 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, they were all over the park. I mean, everywhere in the park, they find evidence of Native Americans. All through the geyser basins, all around the lake, of course. The lake was a really major area. There's about 155 identified archaeological sites around Yellowstone Lake. It's all in that book on the park, and all over the north end of the park. The resources were just too incredible. In the summertime, all the animals and then the lithic materials, they were taking chert and opal out of there, and all the obsidian being traded all over. So it was a major use area. So today we know that's not true. The book that was done, the big research done by Larry Laurendorf, that was done about 10 years ago, called Restoring the Presence, Bringing the Native Americans Back to the Park. They've identified 27 individual Native American tribes that have some sort of cultural affinity to Yellowstone Park, to this area. 27 Native American tribes use this area. Historically here, in this area right here on the Big Bend, and I say historically from what we know, we're more familiar with the use of the Shoshone Indians, which were actually, they were here for like 1,500 years or so. They were pushed out by the encroachment of the Blackfeet and the Crow. The Crow have only been here about 500 or 600 years in this area. But they're the ones we're more familiar with, but there was 27 different tribes. One of the passes, Bozeman Pass, coming over, I always get it wrong, it's called Flathead Pass, and then there's Blackfoot Pass up north, and there's the Sioux Crossing, which goes behind Sheep Mountain. The trail, once you got over Bozeman Pass and came through here, it winds around kind of up where Swingley Road is and goes all the way around to Red Lodge and down the Front Range. That was called the Arapaho Trail. The Arapaho Indians were here. They're in southeastern Wyoming these days. And their stories are really interesting because they don't really remember why, but something happened here and they left. Here being on the Great Big Bend of the Yellowstone. Something happened and the tribe just packed up and just left for whatever reason. They haven't quite figured that out. So the Native Americans were really here using this area a lot. Last summer we spent a day with a Crow historian, Elias Goes Ahead, traveling through the Paradise Valley. We got about 8 hours of tape with him. We got to get transcribed, telling us Crow stories about this area.
Who's that?
Elias Goes Ahead is his name, old-time family in the Crow tribe. And I can't pronounce Crow names, but their name for Paradise Valley, and of course they're roughly translated, they're not names like we use. We call it Paradise Valley, which has a meaning to it, right? Paradise, that's a beautiful place. Their word for that area was a nice place to go. Right, so he said, yeah, we all like it, it's beautiful, we all want to be here in Paradise Valley, this area, so it was used a lot. And inside the park, like I said, all over the hot spring pools, the Firehole Lake Drive, actually, the Firehole Lake Drive, which is off the main drive when you come out of Old Faithful and you're heading north toward Madison, before you get to the Fountain Paint Pots, there's a little one-way side drive to do back in there. And there's a pool back in there when you get back by Firehole Lake off to the right. It's called a Ranger Pool. There's 5 or 6 Ranger pools in the park. And those are pools that are the right temperature to swim in, but that's a one-way ticket out of the park and to see the judge if you get caught in there. But the word was that the fur trappers probably dammed up because there's the hot water coming out of Firehole Lake is really hot. You got to go about a quarter mile down where it cools down enough. And obviously someone dammed it up and created this pool that's about 105, 104 degrees, which is a nice hot bath. Great temperature for soaking in. So they said, oh, the fur trappers must have done this because the Native Americans weren't up here, right? They didn't come up here. Well, George Marler, the geologist in the 1960s, examined that pool very closely, and they determined that yes, it was man-made. There are logs been stacked up across it. There was a dam and dirt was poured over the top of it to create that pool. They know the silica in the water that participates out of the water builds up at a certain rate. They know it's like 1/32 of an inch a year is what it'll build up, okay? So they dated that dam at about 800 years old. So the Native Americans, they knew a good thing, right? They went in there and they dammed that thing up and created themselves a nice hot pool to soak in. They weren't afraid of that here. They're like us. Hot water, that's pretty nice. We like to go to Chico, right, and soak in the hot springs, right? That's what they were doing down there, you know. So dispel that whole myth about Native Americans. They were all over that park and using it just like we do today. And I'm going to read this little thing here. And this was at approximately 3,000 to 3,200 years ago, a male between the age of 35 and 50 years old and between 5'5" and 5'9" in height died near Yellowstone Lake. And this is located in the Fishing Bridge area. His body was elaborately buried for that time. Discovered in 1941, the site was then excavated, and it was excavated by, I want to say, it was one of the big Ivy League schools, Princeton, I think, did the excavation on it. The archaeological digs show that a pit of about 5 feet deep and 6 feet across was dug. A hole down was dug. Placed in the bottom were the bodies of 2 dogs. Interesting, dogs were pretty important. They show an intermediate physiology between coyotes and modern Indian dogs, so they were breeding between coyotes and Indian On top of the dogs was placed 6 projectile points, 6 pretty big points. Then the man's body was placed on top of these. The pit was refilled. Large rocks were brought from miles away, and this is notes I took years and years ago, and placed in a semicircular pattern over the top of the grave. Those rocks actually come from down by the mud volcano area. So they transferred a couple tons of rocks 8 or 9 miles down the river and across the river with it, and covered this burial pit on this. When found, there was a layer of lake and river sediments on top of the stones. On top of that, there was approximately 4 inches of soil containing a layer of carbon relating to a forest fire, and topped off by fully grown mature lodgepole pines. So it completely covered in and grown over in those years. So there's an extremely important ceremonial burial was done there in the Fishing Bridge area 3,200 years ago. So once again, when you talk about the cultural history of Yellowstone Park, don't forget the Native Americans. They like that area as well.
And who did that dig?
They don't know. I believe it was Yale or Princeton, one of those did the dig. I'd have to go back and look. I took these notes a long time ago. And like I said, we found out recently being 20 years ago, I probably did this note about 30 years ago, where those rocks came from. They came from up by the mud volcano area, if I remember rightly. So in 1882, the Crow Reservation was everything on the other side of the Yellowstone River. Okay, it was the Crow Indian Reservation. In April of '82, the U.S. government buys them out and removes all that, reduces their reservation. So that was the last claim of any tribe on property in Yellowstone National Park, was 1882.
Is that 1882?
1882, year before.
Paul, weren't the sheep eaters also in this area?
Oh, yeah. They're part of
Oh.
the Shoshone Indians.
Oh, they
They're
are,
a tribe of
okay,
Shoshones.
okay.
Yeah. They had sheep eaters, buffalo eaters, fish eaters, depending on what area you're in and where they lived. So they were found here. They were also found up along the Lolo Pass area where Lewis and Clark were.
Because Livingston's original town site ended at 7th Street, and I remember just as you cross the footbridge to go across there, that tributary that used to be the Yellowstone until they blocked it off, they found, when they were excavating and developing beyond 7th, they found all sorts of Indian artifacts.
All over this area.
Yeah, just right in town.
There
Well,
I'll
now
tell
in
you,
town.
because if you had the time and the money, you could find an archaeological site every
Yeah, I thought it
mile
was
between
sheep.
here and
Where was
Whitehall.
that again?
The sheep eaters.
But where was the excavation?
At 7th Street, and when the original
Where it
town
runs
site
into
was
the river.
7th Street,
Okay.
South 7th,
That-
where the footbridge is and stuff.
Okay. That's kind of where
That
Fleshing
bank.
Creek came in.
Yeah,
I have collections from people who've dug them out of their backyards down in that area. Dug out points and stuff. They were all over. Just like we are. So anyway, they were Shoshone. The sheep eaters were Shoshone Indians.
okay. I
And they
didn't
were
know
found
that.
down in the Lamar Valley area, but sheep eaters were found elsewhere too.
Yeah.
And they actually tried to stay in the park, but the government kicked them out. And then this treaty was redone in 1882, which
Yeah.
that was the last claim. So